Okay, I think we'll get started. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this seminar on measuring military competition in the 21st century. My name is Henrik Hiim. I'm a professor at the Norwegian Institute for Defense Studies at the Norwegian Defense University College. And I have with me my good colleague, Hiim and Bowers, who is a professor at the same institution. And it is our great pleasure to welcome you to this seminar. I think we have about 80 people who have signed up for this, which is great. We're very grateful to have you here. This seminar is based on a recent publication in the journal Comparative Strategy, which you should find the link to in the invitation to this seminar. We also wrote a shorter version for the e-journal, the War Room, which is part of the US Army War College. So for those of you interested, do check out those publications. The basis for this project, like many good projects, I think, was a sense of frustration in a sense. In this case, a sense of frustration about the way things are measured. So Ian and I both work on security in Asia, me mainly on China, Ian mainly on South Korea, but also other regional actors. And in East Asia, there appears to be a pretty significant military competition going on. You would see it reflected in statements from leaders, in strategy documents, and so forth. But if you look at the way that military competition is traditionally measured, mainly in counting of platforms or by looking at defense expenditure, it appears that no competition is really going on at all. So as we wrote in the War Room article, should we believe the metrics or should we believe our lying eyes? We think that it is the metrics, the way things that are measured, that is the real problem. And Ian will explain in much greater detail why we think that is the case. We also think that a potential sort of solution to this problem is to look at operational concepts instead, to see how militaries are competing. Operational concepts are expressions about how militaries seek to fight future wars, and they can tell us not only much about military competition, but also about how militaries compete and how they perceive the future nature of conflicts. So the plan for this seminar is as follows. I will soon pass it over to Ian, who will introduce our argument for about 20 minutes. After Ian's presentation, we will open it up for questions from you guys. All questions will be in the chat. We have turned off the microphones and cameras, but the chat is open, so just type your questions. I will monitor the chat and then read the questions out loud, and we'll try to answer them to the best of our ability. Ian's introduction will also be available afterwards. We will post it on YouTube, and so will a written summary of the Q&A session. And with that, I think I'm going to pass it over to you, Ian.
Thank you, Henrik. Hello, everybody. I'm just going to share my screen. As Henrik said, our article is called Measuring Military Competition in the 21st Century. And we started off with this very basic premise that we are all assuming that US and China are in the middle of a significant level of military competition. We see these assumptions in policy analysis, in statements by political leaders, in statements by military leaders, in academic literature, and also in the media. However, the data creates a bit of a problem for us. If you look at the two traditional measurements of military competition, budget, for example, here, we're not seeing significant or responsive increases in defense budgets from either the United States or China. For example, China's increases in their defense budget are broadly in line with increases in the size of their general economy. And as China's defense budget is getting bigger, we are not seeing responsive reactions from the United States in terms of significant defense budget increases in order to compete with China or to maintain some sort of competitive edge. Similarly, when we look at platforms, we are also not seeing the United States responding in a like-for-like fashion to Chinese capabilities. All we have to do is look at Chinese shipbuilding capability and capacity and the number of ships and submarines that they are now introducing and are projected to introduce. And the US, while admittedly the Trump administration is trying to increase its shipbuilding capacity and the size of its navy, is not planning to match or meet the capabilities and levels that China seems to be aiming for. And we're seeing similar dynamics in the air domain and in the land domain. So this leads us to the conclusion that potentially the traditional methods that we've had, such as budget competition and weapon system competition, might not work. And if you go back and think about the Cold War, very often analysts, politicians, and practitioners, military practitioners, used both budget competition, but also platform numbers to assess both their military capabilities, the state of military competition, and the military balance. All we have to think about is the nuclear arms race that dominated the Cold War for this discussion, something that we are, as of yet, not quite seeing in the US-China dynamic. And so we have to think about why this is happening. And in our article, we came up with a number of broad explanatory factors. The first one is the fundamental nature of contemporary warfare. And the reality is that advanced militaries no longer see warfighting as a single domain operation. It is no longer going to be about army versus army, but rather the combination of different services and different effects from different sources. The emphasis on joint warfare that we see in the West is also being emphasized in China. And increasingly now, with discussions on multi-domain operations, using space, using cyber, using the electromagnetic spectrum, militaries are no longer expecting to fight purely with one service, but with combinations of services creating multiple different effects. So if you can imagine a fight between China and the United States on the waters of East Asia, this will no longer be solely fought by navies, but will be fought by the air forces, by effects created from land, arguably in cyberspace and in space itself. So contemporary warfare itself is making measurement more complicated. Secondly, and relatedly, we have this introductions of new technologies. And all you have to do is think about cyber effects, which are highly classified, space capabilities, which are very difficult to measure, again, due to classification, and even drone capabilities, which are just difficult to count due to the difficulties of assessing industrial capacities and how useful they are. These new elements in warfighting just make the life of academics and practitioners' job, who assess numbers and assess relative capabilities, much more complicated. Similarly, the operational environment in East Asia, and particularly that between the United States and China, presents a kind of unique challenge for analysts. Primarily, it is because you have one side, China, who is arguably seeking the offensive advantage in order to invade Taiwan, or certainly this is a scenario the United States is preparing for. And the United States is preparing a set of operational concepts and plans and doctrine to defeat them or stop them from doing this. So you have two militaries with two different objectives. And this makes direct comparisons much more difficult for us. And finally, you have this argument about force posture. Now, we all know that the United States is globally deployed. It has forces in Europe. It has many forces currently in the Middle East as a consequence in the war with Iran. But it also has forces, in South America and other areas. Whereas the vast majority of Chinese forces are concentrated in the Indo-Pacific and in their backyard. So again, direct comparisons might not be very useful, as a large proportion of US military force will not be, at least initially, engaged in any conflict with China. To counteract this imbalance, the US is reliant on a system of its network of allies in East Asia, that is primarily Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, Australia, and possibly one or two European allies who might provide support, such as the United Kingdom. China does not have allies. But what it means is that when we're calculating the amount of force the United States can project onto China, we also must include its allies as well. So all of these factors combined make these traditional measurements that we have relied on much more difficult to operationalize. So it leads to this question. Assuming traditional methods no longer have the same efficacy, which we have to assume given the data, how should we measure contemporary military competition? And at this point, we have to emphasize that military competition is something different from the military balance. Right? The military balance is how many forces each side has at any one moment. What we are trying to see is how both sides are competing for some future objective. So what are the dynamics at play right now? And how we decided to look at this is we decided to use the concept or operational concepts. This is, we think, a relatively new approach. As Henrik said, operational concepts are an expression of how a military force wants to fight future wars. They tend to, or the best ones, tend to inform doctrine, tend to inform capability developments, tend to inform how militaries deploy or their future force posture, and will influence how militaries plan and execute operations. So these are forward-looking documents that in their best form are somewhat malleable and somewhat flexible. And also, if done correctly, they are a reflection of current technology and future technological assumptions about capabilities. They reflect the amount of likely money a military force has, the missions that they are likely to carry out, what the adversary is going to be, or who the adversary is going to be, and what capabilities they have, and also what resources they have. So these are important elements when deciding what goes into an operational concept. And as we will argue, and as we argue, both China and the United States operational concepts are directly linked or entangled with each other. Now, when we look at operational concepts, we have to kind of figure out some way of measuring them. And what we look towards is a doctrinal term called the joint functions. Now, the joint functions are a grouping of capabilities that commanders and officers can use to understand what capabilities they have. And they are, in the US doctrine, split into these 7 different areas: command and control, intelligence, fires, movement and maneuver, protection, sustainment, and information. And to break them down very slowly, command and control is how militaries will and officers will command their forces and control them in combat. Intelligence will include things like surveillance, reconnaissance, data collection, satellites, cyber, the open source information, anything like that. Fires are anything that creates effects, be they kinetic, such as missile systems, or softer things such as electromagnetic spectrum actions or even cyber effects. Movement and maneuver is how you deploy and move your forces in a time of war and in a time of crisis. Protection is how you protect those forces in the theater of operations. And then sustainment is about logistical support, and information is about how you use information, how you use the information space to your advantage. So obviously these are collections of different capabilities. And what we are seeing is both militaries in China and the United States, but also in other places around the world, seeking to develop the joint functions in a much more integrated way. And what we are seeing, particularly in the United States and China, is efforts to link command and control, intelligence, fires, and movement maneuver together to make things much, much faster. So militaries will be able to detect adversary actions through upgraded intelligence systems, communicate, understand what those actions mean, develop a plan throughout, and then execute that plan with a variety of fires at any one time. And when we apply this even more detail to the United States and China, what we see, and from the United States side, is a significant emphasis on increased speed, greater range of weapons, and across the different services, an emphasis on more and more greater networked warfighting systems linked most likely to artificial intelligence. So on a joint level, they are developing this idea of joint all-domain operations, or JADO. And on each of the services, they are also developing operational concepts, which are now translating into doctrine. For the US Army, it's called multi-domain operations. For the US Navy, it's distributed maritime operations. and for the US Marine Corps, it's Expeditionary Advanced Base Operations. And the fundamental concept is that at a time of war, these different services will be able to integrate their effects in order to present multiple dilemmas to China and to be able to use what existing fires they have to their greatest utility. And we are seeing this kind of idea being tested in the Indo-Pacific right now. The United States, for example, is operationalizing something called the Joint Fires Network, which is a command and control system that allows commanders to see basically where all the adversary is, where their own forces are, and what the best options they have to target those individual adversary forces. And it is very important to note that many of these operational concepts outline or highlight China as the primary opponent. And as they are evolving align with what China is doing. It's also important to note that the United States is developing a number of new effects, which is increasing the emphasis on mass and range. So the US Army, for example, now is operationalizing a number of long-range precision, medium-range precision standoff munitions that do not just have to be used in a land theater, but importantly, can be used in a maritime theater as well. The US Air Force, for example, is developing a number of cheaper systems which are designed to sink essentially Chinese warships. And there is a reason, for example, that the United States Air Force is maintaining and looking to further develop its B-52 fleet, bomber fleet, and its B-1B bomber fleet, which will have great utility in carrying large amounts of weapons into theater. Similarly, China is also developing these kinds of capabilities. There is a slight irony here that China has identified the US systems approach to warfighting as one of their greatest weaknesses. And in order to target that weakness, they are developing their own systems approach. So systems warfare is an older concept, but still relevant in the Chinese military. And it argues that systems warfare or systems of systems is the nature of the primary adversary, which is the United States, and disrupting those systems is the key to victory. Underneath systems warfare, China is developing a number of other operational concepts and now doctrine. For example, they have something called multi-domain precision warfare, which is designed to exploit their technology, their own ISR capabilities or intelligence gathering capabilities, their own targeting capabilities, which will target key command and control and fire nodes of the United States and its allies. At the same time, you are seeing China invest heavily in a significant number of long-range precision systems that can be fired from land, that can be fired from air, can be fired from the sea as well. And they are also changing their structures. They're also changing their structures in order to best create or best leverage different capabilities such as cyber effects and intelligence. And these structures have sometimes failed, and the Chinese now are kind of revisiting their command and control and force posture in order to best exploit these effects. And it's interesting when we see this kind of dynamic, where you just have to look at how the United States is approaching force protection for their kind of, and in response to Chinese capabilities that they're emphasizing dispersion, and now probably as a result of the war in Iran, hardening of bases and facilities in the Indo-Pacific. So this is extremely important to understand that operational concepts are flexible and they are changing in response to the operational environment. But both sides are competing heavily in line with the key tenets of systems warfare and faster effects, essentially multi-domain operations. And this is important to bear in mind. But at the end of the article, we then head into some further considerations that are quite important. The first one is that operational concepts may not indicate how a war will be fought or who will be successful. So as Van Malt and then Mike Tyson said, everyone's got a plan until they're punched in the face. These operational concepts might not work in real world operations. But that not as important for our argument, which is to say this is how both sides are competing and will give an indication of what capabilities both sides are intending to use in a conflict. We also have to consider how this kind of competition transfers to other theaters. Arguably, the United States and China are the world's two most advanced militaries and well-resourced militaries, and therefore they are pushing the boundaries of what budgets and technology will enable a warfighting machine to do. However, we are seeing similar developments, for example, on the Korean Peninsula, and we can also translate this into the into Europe as well, where NATO is developing its own operational concepts, as are Russia, probably in line with Ukraine and Ukraine as well. Further, we are not arguing that military budgets and platforms don't matter. Of course, they still do. And if we see significant increases in military budgets of China and the United States over the next few years, it will clearly indicate a greater intensification of their strategic rivalry and an intensification of the military competition. Further, also, of course, platform numbers still matter, but our argument is in the Indo-Pacific in particular, they are just increasingly difficult to measure. Also, further, for example, missile depth, magazine depth, as we have seen in Iran, as we have seen in the war between Russia and Ukraine, how many missile systems you have, what your magazine depth is extremely important. And this is one area where it is important to try to measure, but it's incredibly difficult for academics due to the limited number of information. Finally, we have to also think of new areas of strategic and military competition. And we are thinking in four broad areas: the production capacity of any state, particularly in today's era of low-cost, relatively high-tech platforms such as drones. So in the future, military competition might be operational concepts, but also how much production capacity each state has. You see US government officials arguing that one of the greatest strengths in line with allies is their production capacity, but also at the same time, China obviously has a significant amount of production capacity for both drones, unmanned systems, and traditional systems as well. Procurement processes are obviously extremely important in this endeavor as well. How do we buy systems? How fast can we buy new systems coming online? Will be another area of military competition that we are seeing emerging now, and is being emphasized, for example, in Europe. The resilience of our industrial capacities is also increasingly important in future military competition. And this explicitly relates to China and the West's reliance on China for specific components in its own military development, which is an irony that we are seeing emerging from the US-China military competition. And finally, the developmental pace of technology will play an increasing role in how operational concepts transfer into doctrine. So how fast militaries can respond to emerging technologies will be an extremely important element in military competition and how operational concepts develop in the future. And I think with that, I'll stop and we can open up for questions.
Great. Thank you, Ian. Please, everyone, do post questions in the chat. We are very happy to answer them. I think while people are gathering their thoughts, that there is one question that have struck me as we worked on this, which is, there are some problems with traditional measurements, right? But one potential issue with this approach that we're outlining here is that it is more complicated. It's more complex than counting ship numbers and stuff. So. Can this sort of catch on with the added complexity of it? I mean, what do you think about
it? I don't think we should be afraid of complexity when we're doing this kind of work. I think ship numbers or counting platforms is an easier option for many academics or particularly analysts. But we shouldn't be afraid of saying, okay, digging into the weeds a little bit of how states are preparing for war. And we make the argument that operational concepts is one way of doing it. We're not saying this is the only way. No, sure. And this is kind of a first cut. And will it catch on? Well, we're using the joint functions as one way of kind of breaking down what goes into an operational concept and what areas each military is emphasizing within their operational concepts. And of course, I think then it can be taken to another level where we can start trying to analyze where those operational concepts get turned into doctrine, get turned into identifiable procurement processes. But obviously there are challenges. All sides now are making it more difficult to get information. And this is a particular challenge. And you as a China scholar know this. Sure. And in China in particular, compared to 15 years ago, it is much more difficult to get verifiable information about what China is actually attempting to do.
Yep.
So the number of open source documents that we have on the Chinese military is not that many compared to the West. And even in the United States now, it is increasingly difficult to get data that is usable. So I think operational concepts, when they are available, provide a pretty good window for us into seeing how militaries are thinking about the future of war and how militaries are thinking about how they should prepare for war. And that obviously is the source of competition and reflects in the competition.
No. And I think also it's just like the fact that comparing ship numbers, for instance, or number of missiles, or produces some so obviously misleading results in some cases that makes it necessary to sort of think of new approaches. There's a reason why there was a debate about this. Like if you look at the traditional measurements, again, it would look like there is hardly any competition going on at all, which is just obviously misleading.
Exactly. If you go back to the Cold War, like Stanfield Turner, the former admiral and the head of the CIA, identified this problem in the Soviet-US competition. Is like, how do you actually measure how we're competing and what the balance is? Because is ship numbers a reflection of capability or competence? So like we need to find new ways of doing this, but there is a tendency or an easy way of us looking back or leaning in on the old ways, which is just pure number competition.
Yeah. Okay, so we have some questions here in the chat. First one, which I think is a very sort of pertinent question, which is like focusing on production and development or develop potential isn't new. Just look at the American Civil War or the Second World War. So why is this, why do you portray this as a new factor? I think that's a fair point.
I think it's a very fair point, but it's also the reality is that many people tend to ignore it. Historians will tend to focus on it, but then they will tend to it gets lost in the argument about how militaries are competing right now. Also, I think what we're trying to emphasize is maybe the nature of production capacity might be changing a little bit. And I think if we went into more detail, where we would start talking about this is the linkages between China and the United States and industrial production capacity versus the military competition between the two of them. And what would happen, for example, as we have seen, if China turns off certain elements. We know, for example, the number of Chinese microchips that are in a new US aircraft carrier. Or we go to Ukraine, we have a pretty good idea of how many Chinese components go into a Russian drone and how many Chinese components go into a Ukrainian drone. I think there are new elements to explore within that process, but it is a fair point.
Yeah, it is. It's also important because in the context of a US-China conflict over Taiwan, some of the wargaming being done on this demonstrate that one of the things that could happen relatively quick is the two of them sort of running low on munitions and especially missiles. So there's even some of the war games, indicating that even if the US sort of wins the conflict, it could be a bit of a Pyrrhic victory because the supreme Chinese industrial capacity would make them able to reconstitute faster, both in terms of whether it's ships or missiles or the things that you would need to rebuild, right?
For sure.
Which speaks to the importance of the industrial
capacity. I think on this final point, if we see really significant changes in how, particularly the United States, goes about developing its own production capacity and its allies. And we're seeing beginnings of this already in terms of like de-risking from China, but it's kind of piecemeal in many ways. And if you see a really serious effort on this, then I think we will start seeing that will be a pretty good indicator of, significantly increased military tension.
Right. There's some other questions here. One is like the experience of the war in Ukraine has demonstrated the importance of robotic warfare, I guess, particularly drones, right? But not everyone understands the lack of alternative to this shift. In your opinion, does the concept of the US Navy and Marine Corps called the Unmanned Campaign Framework, published in 2021, have a Chinese counterpart? And does it indicate military competition?
You are the Chinese guys.
I don't know if there's a concrete concept for it in the sense like that there is I haven't seen a name for it, but there is for sure a Chinese substantial effort to increase their sort of integrate unmanned systems in their forces, whether it's the Navy, the Air Force, across the VLA, basically. And I think, the fact that the Chinese have such something approaching a monopoly on the actual production of at least many components for drones speak to it. I think this has been true for some time also. The emphasis on integrating unmanned systems, in particularly Taiwan campaigns that they outline. It's not a new thing.
But I guess you could also say, the unmanned system question is interesting, and how you might say legacy or how militaries prepare for that in peacetime is a problem that any military officer knows right now is very problematic. You know, how do you integrate unmanned systems in peacetime now when the technological development is so fast? Is so quick. So when you operationalize them in a war in a year's time, they'll be out of date, potentially out of date already. So I think this is an interesting challenge for both China and the United States, as it is for all other NATO countries as well, or all militaries. Is how do you actually do this? So there's no doubt that both sides are focused on. I think there's no doubt that both sides are focused on this. But having said that, we don't know a lot about either side is thinking of operationalizing this and how quickly that will shift in the middle of a war. So the innovation race mid-conflict might arguably be more important for that assessment, I think.
And I think, if you're talking again like the Taiwan scenario, I think one thing which a lot of people is increasingly realizing is that it's going to be a protracted conflict. Absolutely. Most likely, it's not going to be a quick conflict. It's going to drag out. Whether, we're talking a blockade scenario or a full-on attempt at invasion or some sort of combination of them. There's another good question here, which I think deals with it in an issue. We do get a bit into that in the article, but it says, like, if the budget is not reflecting competition, would it be right to say that the competition is based on reorienting of resources and focusing existing resources into this specific conflict?
I think that's probably to a degree absolutely true. Where you're seeing in the US endeavors to reorientate, or for a long time since the Obama administration, they've tried to reorientate existing resources towards the Indo-Pacific, whether you call it the pivot to the Indo-Pacific or whatever they're calling it now. So this is an endeavor the United States is trying to achieve. However, it is very difficult for them because of other conflicts. So the war
getting stuck
in other conflicts, and this is a problem for the United States military. And you see a lot of this from U.S. analysts, particularly those focused on the Indo-Pacific, who argue that we are just taking these conflicts are just taking resources away from the Indo-Pacific theater, or the combatant commander in the Indo-Pacific. So I think that's one way of looking at it. And also, I think there's been some action within the U.S. Congress to show that that the Indo-Pacific should be prioritized in terms of their needs are the ones that should drive future military development. But we're not. But again, we're not seeing massive budgetary increases yet. So yes, you're absolutely right. I think a lot of this is trying to reorientate budgets away from the Middle East and from Europe and into the Indo-Pacific. And arguably, some of the Trump administration is trying to do in reducing U.S. forces in Europe for NATO, they should be reorientated towards the Indo-Pacific.
Right. No, and this is a long-term trend, right? This has been happening for quite a while. For China, there's one sort of specific thing which I think is important to add to this, right? Which again speaks to why budgets are difficult to use. Like in relative terms, Chinese military budgets are close to 2%. It depends a bit on how you assess them. They are famously difficult to get a proper insight, but around 2% of GDP. But in real terms, the increase has been massive for, the past 30 years because of the immense Chinese economic growth, right? So yeah. Okay, there's some further question. And this one is interesting also. It asks whether our approach can be used in reverse to sort of assess or predict the results of future military actions or wars. Can we use this to sort of see, how a war is unfolding and who would be, come out on top potentially?
I think I would kind of like to to hedge that answer. I'm not sure if this approach works because as many military officers have said to me, operational concepts are uncertain beasts, and how they translate into doctrine in reality and then how they translate into the real world is quite difficult. And every war has its own nature. So what we are looking at in a conflict between, if we just focus on the China-US dynamic, this would be two peer competitors fighting in the land maritime domain in a way, a mode of warfare that we really haven't seen before. So what will happen in that mode is very, very difficult to assess. I think what they can do is they do give us an indication of how both sides intend to fight, right? And we are seeing, for example, or we think we have seen many of the elements that have been developed by the United States with China in mind, or the Indo-Pacific in mind, being used, for example, in the conflict with Iran in the last few months, which is just targeting or faster targeting, the use of precision munitions, that kind of thing. So I think that's an important thing to bear in mind. But can you reverse engineer to say, well, we can predict because of this is what's going to win? I think that's a very difficult thing to measure. If you just take, for example, the US Marine Corps operational concept, which is a really interesting one and one of the most available, they still have a lot of challenges before they can operationalize it fully, particularly on the logistics and resupply side. So there are elements that need to be in place before they fully realize these things. So that's what we're trying to say. This is about pathways of competition and how both sides are competing rather than about how sides will come out at the end of a fight, essentially.
But I think it can also potentially be used. There are others who have discussed this too, but as you say, to, say something about how they both intend to fight a conflict. And one of the concerning things, which we have talked about and written about in other contexts, that's that they're both basically planning to paralyze the systems of the adversary, right? That's the plan. Paralyze the adversary by going after command and control nodes, by going after, ISR capabilities, information systems, when in a way that could prove quite escalatory. It's a bit of a question, right? What happens if you blind China in a conflict? What happens if you blind the US or China in a conflict? Then the pathways to escalation could be potentially quite dramatic. So that's another element of this.
So I think that question also goes to the difficulty of assessing what a US-China conflict actually looks like. If it is over Taiwan, then as we've discussed, I know there's a discussion, what does the end of that conflict look like?
Right.
How does it end? Does it escalate? Does it there's so many questions about what it is. Not just like a Cold War battle over like a few fields in Europe. This is something that is much more dynamic, where we're not entirely sure what it looks like, moving into the week 2, week 3, week 4 of that conflict. It's difficult to assess, I think.
No, it is. Okay, so another question here is how do hypersonic glide weapons such as China's Dongfang series, they have the DF-17, which is deployed, compare with the US AGM-183A in terms of capabilities? How should those capabilities be taken into account when assessing the competition between the two countries? So what do you think?
I would say direct system-to-system comparison is a kind of useful academic exercise, but from our point of view, you need to actually look at the entire system surrounding them to assess their full efficacy. So it goes from the ISR systems that those missile systems actually rely on to target things, which is very important to understand, how quickly they can be used in conflict. So basically the command and control process from detection to use, and then also the relative air defense systems of the adversary as well.
Yeah.
So I think, I'm not a technical expert on missile systems, so I'm not going to say, well, this is obviously better than that. I don't know. I have a lot of faith in U.S. capabilities, but I think it is very important for us now to start realizing that, one missile system or one weapon system does not operate in a vacuum. And comparing them is, it'll be a number of different capabilities interlinked that will reflect their effectiveness moving forward.
Yeah. I will say, though, I will add that on hypersonic glide vehicles, that particular type of technology, there is a bit of a technological race between the two. And the Chinese seem to be one of the areas. I'm not saying that the Chinese are ahead in most areas, because they're not. But that is one niche where the Chinese are probably ahead of them.
Well, certainly many American analysts and even official documents have kind of argued that China got ahead of that one faster than the United States did. Yeah, and certainly they fielded them faster than the United States did.
Yes, the F-17 is an example of a system that's already been fielded, exactly. And so they have a sort of operational hypersonic glide weapon capability with regional range, but they're developing long range stuff too. So that's, in that particular area, there is a pretty significant technological competition going on.
But I think that question raises an interesting point about the effectiveness of these conventional long-range precision systems in creating strategic effect. And as we've seen in following Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, and also arguably what we think now in the recent Iranian conflict, that a large number of precision munitions being used, but still not being game changers in many respects. So I think it's an interesting thing to look at. Now, maybe Chinese and US capabilities will be different than what we've seen in terms of the mass of fires that they will be able to do.
I know a lot of them.
And I know many US analysts maybe not really as concerned about the type of system that China has versus the sheer number of systems that China has and how they can defend against that number. But it is an interesting question. And also I think we have to kind of look at, how effective these systems will be against individual ships, as that's how China's going to use them. There's interesting variables moving forward.
Yeah, the numbers bit is extremely important also because of the, if they lob enough of them, you can have as good as a air defense system as you want, but there would just be a sheer numbers problem,
exactly,
which is extremely hard
exactly.
to deal with. Yeah. Okay, so one other question here is how this translates into other regions. You kind of started a bit on it, but if this was sort of a NATO-Russia thing we were looking at, would this sort of methodology, this approach apply also in terms of, this is a good way to measure military competition between Russia and NATO as well, you think?
Well, I think it's difficult. NATO, obviously, for those who don't know, or those who do, NATO has its own multi-domain operations concept, where they are trying to integrate space and cyber into their operations, and then over time, develop some of the same command and control ISR linkages and then effects or fires linkages that the US is trying to do. But obviously for NATO, it's very complicated. They're trying to link 32 countries together and a lot of legacy systems together. That's really hard. And Russia, currently is in the midst of a conflict with Ukraine, where it has shown, in large sections, an inability to do very much.
Right.
So it's difficult to see and what's happening. So the traditional Russian operational concepts or doctrine seems to have run into problems as they have met Ukrainian technology such as drones and precision munitions, and their ability to kind of mass effects or exploit momentum is very difficult for Russia. So right now we're not seeing that, I don't think. But we are seeing on NATO an effort to change how they are warfighting, what they're calling digitization. But I think maybe what's even more important is that the United States is developing a set of operational concepts, translating them into doctrine and capabilities for a China conflict And as a consequence, their level of capabilities and way of war fighting is separating away from the rest of NATO. So the gap between NATO and the United States, or the rest of NATO and the United States, is getting bigger. And I think maybe moving forward, we should have some concerns about interoperability and other areas like that. And I think finally, inevitably, or history has shown, assuming the NATO alliance remains, in place in the same modes that we've seen before, that NATO tends to follow the pathway of the United States moving forward. So I think, this could set the tone, right? So I think that's kind of an interesting way. So I think that's kind of why we should pay attention to that, what's going on in the Indo-Pacific, because it does set some sort of direction of travel for how militaries will fight on this kind of broader operational level concept.
Right. Great. Okay. Further question here in the chat, which is good. It's a bit complicated, but it's good. What indicator do you think is most indicative when measuring competition when we compare command and control systems of the US and China?
Oh, that's a fascinating question. I'm trying to think of how you would say one indicator is the most indicative. It's very difficult to assess Chinese command and control systems.
Yes,
unfortunately.
Yes.
But what we do know is the Chinese are, investing in and operationalizing the same kind of data transfer networks that we have, such as Link 22 or Link 21 and all the link systems and even more advanced stuff than that. So the Chinese are trying to do that. So that's an important thing to bear in mind. I think from a Chinese perspective, command and control structures are changing a little bit, right? But there is obviously a lot of flex in terms of, all of these generals being fired. What's happening on that kind of working level is interesting, and where, Xi sits within command and control in China is an interesting point.
One question I wish I had the answer to, but which is just very murky, is how the Chinese assess their sort of political commissar system, which is similar to what the Russians have had back in the day, right? Which, and for those of you who don't know, in the People's Liberation Army, you have commanders, and then you have political commissars, and in theory, they are supposed to have different responsibilities. One is supposed to be the operational commander, the other one is supposed to be responsible for political work. But in reality, it can often be a bit complex. It can create, an inefficient organization potentially. But how this is changing, like a lot of that is very murky.
Well, I would say though, in like the recent, the kind of much more intense series of exercises around Taiwan for the last 2 or 3 or 4 years at this stage, I suppose, have shown that China is testing and experimenting with kind of more advanced or more integrated joint operations, which suggests that their command and control systems are getting more effective.
It does, because it's traditionally been a weakness, like the ability to actually operate jointly.
Exactly. So from the US side, then, what measure they would use, I think the measure they're trying to use is how successful they are connecting new technologies with legacy systems and how usable that is without humans in the loop within their battle networks. And I think that's quite interesting. And the next question, I'm just going to jump in on that.
Yeah.
So then this idea of AI implementation, a lot of what the US is doing now and aiming to achieve in their operational concepts and now in their operations is this use of AI, be it agentic AI, where it's kind of running in the background, just doing tasks that the humans don't see, or whether it's AI suggesting COAs, suggesting courses of action and other things which humans have to approve. And obviously that's an entirely different debate.
No.
But, there's little doubt that given the amount of data that is coming into military headquarters, processing that data requires AI. It can't be achieved without it. So then it's how you use that better. And I think that's
the Chinese are trying to do the same thing. Basically,
we know they are.
We have this clunky concept, typically clunky Chinese concepts of intelligentization, which is like supposed to be the new way of warfare, which speaks to integrating AI everywhere.
Yes.
Will they be able to pull that off? We don't know.
We don't know.
So
it's a good way of ending the conversation.
It's a good way of ending the conversation. So thanks everyone for excellent questions, for your participation. It's been a real pleasure to host this this seminar.
Thank you.
And again, the introduction will be posted on YouTube, a summary of the Q&A session. And thanks everyone for joining.
Thank you.